A sea snail's shell no bigger than a thumbnail with a single hole punched through it. It's a flat periwinkle. It comes from the Atlantic coast and it's lying inland in a limestone valley in central Portugal where no sea snail has any business being. Somebody carried it here on purpose. Somebody laid it at the throat of a 4-year-old and then covered the grave in red ochre so heavily that the stains soaked into the sediment and stopped sharply at the outline of the body. That's most of what we have. A shell, a stain, 4 pierced deer teeth, and a small skeleton in a shallow pit at the back of a rock shelter. It's been in the ground for about 28,000 years, and it started one of the nastiest arguments in the modern study of human origins. Because when the team that dug it up published what they thought the bones meant, they said something that in 1999 was close to unsayable. They said this child descended from populations that were part Neanderthal. The response wasn't really a debate. Senior figures in the field said the reading was not just wrong but impossible, because Neanderthals and modern humans were separate species, and separate species don't leave joint descendants. One commentary in the same journal in the same month dismissed the whole thing in a phrase: "This is simply a chunky Gravettian child." 11 years later, a technology that didn't exist when that sentence was written finished reading a Neanderthal genome. Then the answer came back: they interbred. Anyone alive today whose ancestry runs outside Africa is carrying the evidence in their own cells. So the people who dug up the child were right, and the people who mocked them were wrong. Except that isn't quite what happened. And the gap between what actually got proven and what everyone remembers being proven is the most useful thing in this whole story. The site is found by accident, and it's found already half destroyed. The Abrigo do Lagar Velho is a rock shelter in the Lapido Valley near Leiria on the south side of a limestone cliff in central western Portugal. In 1992, the landowner brings in a machine and scrapes almost all of the shelter's upper deposits away. Nobody's looking for a burial. Nobody knows there's anything there. 6 years later, 2 local field scouts, Joe Mauricio and Pedro Saudo, go up to the shelter to check a report of prehistoric paintings. They find some. And then, along the back wall, one of them notices a rodent burrow. Burrowing animals do archaeologists a peculiar favor. They dig down and they push what's down there up to the surface. On November 28, 1998, in the spoil from that burrow, the scouts find the bones of a small left hand and forearm. What happens next is a salvage dig, which means a race. The excavation is led by the archaeologist Joe Zilhau, with the bioarchaeologist Cidalia Duarte and the archaeologist Cristina Araujo. It runs from the 12th of December to the 7th of January through a Portuguese winter at the base of a cliff. Photographs go out by email every day to the anatomist Eric Trinkhaus in the United States, who's reading the anatomy from images while the sediment is still being lifted. What comes out of the ground is remarkable, and it's damaged. The skull was in the path of the bulldozer. About 80% of it gets reconstructed from scattered fragments. But below the neck, the skeleton is virtually complete, with both the baby teeth and the permanent teeth still there to be read. From the teeth, the team estimates an age at death of about 4 years and 2 months, with a probable range of 3.5 to 5. That's the whole life, 4 years, give or take, meet Sina. We don't know a single thing about the adults who dug this grave, so we're going to give one of them a name and be honest that the name is a device. Sina is whoever prepares the body. That work is legible in the ground even now because the ochre stain stops at the edge of where the body was. It didn't seep, something contained it. The most likely reading is that the child was wrapped in hide, in bark, in something that rotted away and left only the sharp line of the pigment it held. The pierced periwinkle shell sits at the neck. It's the same kind of ornament, drilled the same way, as shells from Gruta do Caldeiro, a cave not far off, in a layer dated to around 26,000 radiocarbon years. So it isn't a strange object, it's a normal object from a normal ornament tradition placed on a body with care. 4 pierced red deer canines come out with the skull fragments. Charcoal from burned Scots pine lies under the right leg. Rabbit bones lie between the legs, ochre-stained, in contact with the body. Red deer bones lie at the head and at the feet. And the people doing this aren't improvising. The Gravettian is a culture that runs across Europe for thousands of years, and burying the dead deliberately with ornaments and pigment is part of what it does. Graves like this turn up from Portugal to Russia. Ochre, beads, shells carried far inland from whatever coast they came from, bodies arranged rather than dropped. This burial is unusual for its completeness and for what the bones turned out to start, not for the fact that it happened, which is worth holding on to because the argument that follows is going to be about categories of human being, and the behavior in this grave is one that both kinds of people were doing. Neanderthals buried their dead too. It looks, in 1999, like a full ritual. A fire lit in the pit, animals killed for the grave, a wrapped and painted child laid down with ornaments, and we'll come back to that because a study published in 2025 takes a scalpel to about half of it. Now the anatomy, which is where the trouble starts. The team's claim isn't that the child looks Neanderthal, it's stranger than that. The claim is that the child looks like 2 things at once in a pattern that doesn't sort cleanly. Start with the modern side because it's the part almost nobody disputes. The jaw has a real chin, not a suggestion of one, a proper bony chin with a strong central boss and a deep hollow above it. Neanderthals don't have that. A true chin is the single most distinctive thing about the modern human skeleton from the neck up, and this child has it at 4 years old. The teeth agree. The proportions of the front teeth against the molars fall with early modern humans and sit apart from Neanderthals. So do details of the forearm. The bump on the radius where the biceps attaches sits in the position found in every European early Upper Paleolithic human the team could compare it to. The bone has the shallow curve typical of modern forearms, not the deeper Neanderthal curve. The proportions of the pelvis at the front fall inside the modern range. By that list, this is a modern human child, buried in a modern human way, in a modern human culture. The Gravettian is squarely ours. Then you go below the waist and the numbers stop cooperating. The shin is short relative to the thigh, not slightly. The team reports the ratio sitting more than 2 standard deviations below their recent human comparison, a z-score of -2.04. The shin bone is also thick for its length by a lot. Its circumference against its length gives a z-score of 2.58, which puts it beyond the Neanderthal specimen they compare it against. Short, thick lower legs. The technical phrase in the paper is hyperarctic. There's more. The knee joint's upper surface is displaced backward by 20 millimeters, a pattern the team describes as Neanderthal. The muscle markings on the upper arm where the chest muscles pull are most similar to Neanderthals. And the front of that very modern chin turns out to sit on a jaw whose symphysis slopes back at 89 degrees, right on top of the juvenile Neanderthal average of 90.3, plus or minus 4 and a bit. So the child has a modern chin bolted onto a Neanderthal angled jaw. That's the mosaic. And here's the argument the team builds on it, which is more careful than the press coverage ever made it sound. You could explain a mixed-looking skeleton by saying it's just primitive, that this is what the ancestral form looked like before either lineage specialized. The team closes that door by pointing at the chin. A chin isn't ancestral. It's a uniquely modern invention, found in us and nowhere before us. A body can't be an unspecialized leftover and carry a signature modern novelty at the same time, and they're equally careful about what kind of mixing they're proposing. They are explicitly not claiming this is a first-generation hybrid, a Neanderthal child of a modern parent. Their sentence is that this child was not the result of a rare interbreeding, but the descendant of extensively admixed populations. In other words, this isn't one dramatic couple. This is what a population looks like thousands of years after two kinds of people stopped being two kinds of people. That's the claim. Now watch what happens to it. To understand the reaction, you have to understand what the standard position was in 1999 and how firmly it was held. Neanderthals were a separate species. Homo neanderthalensis, not Homo sapiens. They lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, and then, somewhere between 40 and 30,000 years ago, modern humans arrived and Neanderthals ended. The dominant reading of that ending was replacement without descent. They didn't blend into us, they stopped. There were people arguing the other way, but the mitochondrial DNA that had been recovered from Neanderthal bone by the late 90s looked cleanly separate from ours, and that was widely read as settling it. So when the Lagar Velho paper appears in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in June of 1999, it isn't landing in an open question. It's landing on a closed one. And in that same issue in the same month, the journal runs a commentary by Ian Tattersall and Jeffrey Schwartz. Their argument has two legs and neither of them is nonsense. The first is archaeological. The burial is Gravettian. It's ours in every detail, the ornaments, the ochre, the practice. There is nothing Mousterian about it, nothing that carries a Neanderthal cultural signature. If this child came from a blended population, where's the blended toolkit? The second is anatomical, and it's the sharper one. They argue the specimen doesn't actually carry derived Neanderthal features, not the diagnostic ones, the ones that only Neanderthals have. Being stocky isn't a Neanderthal trait. It's a cold climate trait, and it shows up in cold-adapted populations of every kind. Their conclusion is the line that follows this skeleton around to this day. The probability must thus remain, they write, that this is simply a chunky Gravettian child, a descendant of the modern invaders who had evicted the Neanderthals from Iberia several millennia earlier. It's a good sentence. It's also a dismissal, and the tone travels. The Discovery team fires back in print. Trinkhaus and Zilhau publish a formal correction to the commentary, which is roughly the academic equivalent of raising your voice. And other objections arrive that don't depend on species dogma at all, which matters because those are the ones still standing. The most serious comes from the developmental side. Christoph Zollikofer at Zurich and others make a simple point about age. This is a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old skull is not a small adult skull. Many of the features paleoanthropologists use to sort adult specimens haven't formed yet at 4. The mastoid region behind the ear, for instance, is only just beginning the growth that will give it adult shape. Read A Child by Adult Criteria, and you'll find whatever you're primed to find. Their reading is that there's nothing in this child's skull and teeth that would be unusual for a modern human at that stage of growth, and that grown to adulthood, this individual would have looked conventionally modern. And the body proportions have an alternative explanation that doesn't need a single Neanderthal ancestor. Bodies in cold places get shorter and thicker. That's not a lineage marker, it's a rule of climate that applies to living human populations right now. Iberia 28,000 years ago was cold. A modern human population living there for a long time could shorten its shins on its own, with nobody's help. And then there's the timing, which in 1999 looked like the killing blow. The team's own dates put the burial at roughly 24 to 25,000 radiocarbon years, charcoal at 24,860, red deer at 24,660 and 24,520, rabbit at 23,920. Whichever way you convert those into calendar years, the child is living thousands of years after the last Neanderthals in Iberia. So the critics could ask a question that sounds unanswerable. If the Neanderthals have been gone for millennia, why does this one child still look like them, when nobody else from the same period does? Then the ground moves, and it moves from a direction nobody in that argument could reach. In May of 2010, a team publishes a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, more than 4 billion nucleotides, pulled from 3 individuals, out of bone powder that everyone had assumed was too degraded to give up anything useful. Understand why that's the hinge. In 1999, the only Neanderthal DNA anyone had was mitochondrial, a tiny loop of genetic material inherited down the female line, useful for asking whether 2 lineages are distinct, useless for asking whether they mixed. A population can absorb ancestry from another population and lose every trace of it in the mitochondria within a few generations, purely by chance. The tool everyone was leaning on to close the question physically could not answer it. What 2010 adds is the rest of the genome, the nuclear DNA, billions of letters, most of it shredded into fragments shorter than this sentence and mixed with modern contamination and soil bacteria. Sorting that took a decade of method building that simply hadn't been invented when the Lagar Velho paper was being mocked. And the comparison to living people gives an answer that isn't ambiguous. Between 1 and 4% of the genome of every non-African person tested comes from Neanderthals. Not a trace, not contamination, ancestry. The thing that had been called impossible 11 years earlier is sitting in the DNA of most of the people who'd been calling it impossible, and the finds keep coming. In 2015, a jawbone from a cave in Romania, from a man who lived somewhere between 42 and 37,000 years ago, turns out to be 6 to 9% Neanderthal, with 3 stretches of Neanderthal DNA so long they can't have had time to break up. That man had a Neanderthal ancestor 4 to 6 generations back, a great-great-grandparent, give or take. That's not statistical inference about deep time. That's a family. And by 2024, the picture gets sharp. Genomes from some of the oldest modern humans in Europe, individuals from Ronnies in Germany and Zlady Kun in Czechia, around 45,000 years old, carry about 2.9% Neanderthal ancestry. The mixing they record is best explained as a single event, shared by all non-Africans, dated to roughly 45 to 49,000 years ago. Other work using a larger set of genomes puts the gene flow starting around 50,500 years ago and running for something like 7,000 years, with the main pulse near 47,000. The estimates differ in their edges. They agree on the shape. Present-day non-Africans carry roughly 2 to 3% Neanderthal ancestry today. So here's what the genomics establishes, stated exactly. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, and their mixed descendants are the ancestors of most people on Earth. Every modern human population that left Africa carries the result, which means that the population living in Iberia 28,000 years ago, the people who buried this child, certainly had Neanderthal ancestry. That isn't a conjecture anymore, it's a floor. Everybody in Gravettian Europe was, in the strict sense the discovery team used, the descendant of admixed populations. The general claim in that 1999 paper is now simply true, and this is exactly where the story usually stops with the vindication, and this is exactly where it shouldn't, because 2 different claims were made in 1999, and only one of them has been settled. The first claim is that Neanderthals and modern humans interbred and left joint descendants. That's proven. It's about as proven as anything in this field gets. The second claim is that this particular skeleton's proportions are a readable record of that interbreeding, that the short shins and the backward-sloping jaw are what a few % of Neanderthal ancestry looks like from the outside, in one child 28,000 years ago. That is not proven. It's still argued about, and the counterarguments didn't die when the genome arrived because they never depended on the genome. The developmental objection stands. This is still a 4-year-old, and reading a 4-year-old with adult criteria is still hard. The climate objection stands. Short, thick legs are still what cold does to bodies, whoever's bodies they are. And a new problem arrives that the original argument didn't have to deal with. If everybody in Europe at that time carried 2 or 3% Neanderthal ancestry, then that ancestry cannot be why this one child looks unusual and the other burials from the same culture don't. A trait shared by everyone can't explain a difference between them. The team's specific proposal was stronger than the general one. They weren't just saying there was some Neanderthal ancestry in the mix. They were saying that in Iberia, Neanderthal populations survived late and mixed locally, and that this child's body still carried the shape of it. The genomic record so far shows one main mixing event, tens of thousands of years earlier, shared by everyone. It does not so far show a separate late Iberian contribution. That specific piece hasn't been confirmed. There's no way to settle it directly either. No ancient DNA has been recovered from this child. The preservation is poor, and there's a limit to how much sampling anyone will do on a skeleton this rare for a result this uncertain. The one thing that has been settled is the calendar. In 2025, a team led by Bethan Linscott publishes a direct date on the child's own right forearm bone, using a method that isolates a single amino acid from bone collagen hydroxyproline, which makes up about 12% of the amino acids in mammalian collagen and, crucially, can't come from contamination in the soil. 4 earlier attempts to date this skeleton directly had failed or given inconsistent answers spread across 6,000 years. The new measurement lands between 27,780 and 28,550 calendar years ago, which, once you convert the old radiocarbon figures into calendar years, is roughly where the 1999 team said the burial was all along. The chronology held. The same study also takes something away. The red deer bones in the grave turn out to be substantially older than the child, so they weren't animals killed for the funeral, more likely old bone already in the ground, possibly used to build up the pit. The charcoal under the leg is at least 150 years older than the burial, which means there was no fire lit in that pit that night. The rabbit bones, ochre-stained and touching the legs, still look deliberate, so the ritual gets smaller and more precise, not a pyre and a sacrifice. A wrapped body, pigment, a shell at the throat, deer teeth, and a small animal placed against the legs, which is, if anything, more recognizable. Somebody ground the ochre. Somebody drilled the shell and carried it inland. Somebody wrapped a 4-year-old carefully enough that the pigment held its line for 28,000 years. That much isn't in dispute and never was. Here's what to take from the argument around it. In 1999, a claim got ridiculed because it violated a consensus, and 11 years later the consensus broke and the claim's general form was proven correct. That's a real thing, and it should make anyone cautious about how confidently the current consensus on anything is stated. But the vindication was partial, and the difference matters. A claim can be right in its conclusion and unproven in its evidence at the same time. Being right about the world isn't the same as having read a particular object correctly, and the two get folded together constantly, in every field, usually in favor of whoever we've decided was the underdog. The honest position on this skeleton is uncomfortable, and it's the only one the evidence supports. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred, certain. This child's population carried Neanderthal ancestry, near certain, because everyone's did. This child's short shins and heavy jaw are the visible trace of it, unresolved and possibly unresolvable. Without DNA nobody can get. The child was 4. Somebody loved them enough to spend hours on a grave. The rest is us, arguing about what a small body means for as long as we've had the tools to argue with, and the tools